What's up, everyone? Welcome to Neil's show. Neil's not here, so I will be hosting. If you're not familiar, which you should be because I'm on this show every week, you can follow me on Twitter at ShipMyMoney DFS. I will do my best to fill in for Neil as a host on this show. I cannot make myself look 20 years older, and you'll have to deal with increased aura, charisma, all of that. But I'll do my best to do what Neil would do. Neil is traveling. He is in New Orleans or on his way to New Orleans or something at one of the live finals that he did not qualify for, but got invited to because people felt sorry or something. So he's in New Orleans. He's on his way to New Orleans, something. He will not be doing a live before lock show for tonight or for Monday. But I'll be doing the 1:30-ish show obviously today and also on Monday for him. He begged me, he paid me, so I agreed to do it. But gonna go keep the same format that we normally do, going through looking at how I used Run the Sims. I did use custom ownership, so I will touch on that. Obviously, things will be a little bit choppier because I have to navigate multiple screens at once instead of just ignoring Neil while he talks and figuring out what I want to say next. But other than that, going to keep a similar format for the show, starting with quarterbacks. You can see my exposures on the screen, obviously, which is probably more useful than seeing Neil's in general. But in the run I did before the show, and I think that this is an interesting slate to talk about, there's a lot of moving parts, a lot of different assumptions you can make. Obviously, I'll plug Run the Sims, but it's true for any optimizer or projection set or sim or whatever you're going to use. There's a lot of different spots where I think if you're not happy or not comfortable with like the exposures you're getting to, that you can adjust projections. Obviously, with Run the Sims, it would be just adjusting market share or whatever, touchdown percentage, anything for different players. But there's a lot of variables here with Tampa Bay returning Mike Evans, returning Jalen McMillan. We haven't had a game yet this season where Tampa Bay has been at full strength at wide receiver. At the beginning of the year, you had Egbuka and Evans with no Godwin. Then you have had, recently full strength Godwin plus Egbuka with no Evans. This is a game that they need to win. They're tied with the Panthers for first place in the NFC South. So I think that there's a lot of different assumptions that you can make. I'll talk about those as we go through the show. But starting at quarterback, they're not super important. Those assumptions, those variables aren't super important here. But I do think you can make the case for Baker Mayfield being a stronger play than usual for two reasons. One being that he actually has his full complement of wide receivers. But two, you do have Tristan Wirfs probable as well. He's missed games recently. Obviously, we've seen Baker kind of drop off in terms of his quarterback play as the year has gone on. Started out the year really, really well, has kind of just come back to earth, but he does have his full complement of wide receivers now. He's not a run first quarterback, certainly, but he is somebody that will run a little bit. In the Sims that I ran, I had Baker projected for 63% flex ownership, 12% captain ownership. I had Kirk Cousins projected for about 30% flex and about 2% captain. So I got to a good amount of Baker. I got to 52% at flex, so a little bit below the field. But then I was over the field at captain. I got to 23% at captain. And I do think that makes some sense now that he has more wide receivers to spread the ball out to. I think it's very difficult, and there's a lot of volatility in how you project Godwin, how you project Egbuka and Evans. Also, you have Cade Otton is doubtful. There was just a question in chat about do we think Durham is still plug and play the Otton role like he did last year? That's its whole separate conversation also. But there are so many ways that Mayfield can spread the ball out. Also, not only are they finally healthy at wide receiver, you have Bucky Irving back. Obviously, you have Rashad White. You still had Sean Tucker having a role last week. So there's just so many ways that Baker Mayfield can distribute the ball here to where he maybe has a more productive game than he has on average this year and, has a big game, but you don't necessarily have one of his pass catchers have a monster game and outperform him. So I do think that Mayfield's a pretty interesting captain option, just given, that this team is finally back at full strength, should clearly benefit him while in some ways hurting his pass catchers individually. You could also argue that it benefits them some in that, it's probably easier for Egbuka to get open when Chris Godwin and Mike Evans are on the field than when Tez Johnson and Sterling Shepard are on the field. No disrespect to them, but obviously, levels to the talent at wide receiver. But at the same time, clearly, Godwin going to draw more targets on average than those guys. Evans going to draw more targets, especially in the red zone, than those guys. So as a net, I think you could argue that it's a net positive for Mayfield while being a net negative for each individual pass catcher on Tampa Bay potentially. On the other side, for Kirk Cousins, I'm getting 29% at flex. I'm getting 1% at captain. That's pretty much in line with the ownership that I used. I had 2% at captain. I had 30% at flex. Kirk Cousins sucks at this point in his career. He doesn't have Drake London, so he's missing his top pass catcher. Darnell Mooney hasn't been getting it done this year. You have David Sills and Dylan Drummond, whoever the hell they are, as the next two guys up in terms of routes run at wide receiver for Atlanta. Obviously, Kyle Pitts, solid option at tight end, running 90+% of routes. But you have a diminished Kirk Cousins. He's not going to run. He's not very good at throwing anymore either. You have an Atlanta passing game that your running back and your tight end are your best pass catchers, really, with no Drake London. So clearly not somebody that I'm going to feel very good getting a lot of. He is only 8,800 as a starting quarterback, so he is still a solid enough value, but pretty low projection on him. You can see that we have, these are the projections that came out of the Sims, 20 fantasy points on DraftKings to Baker Mayfield, only about 13 to Kirk Cousins. So a pretty big gap there in terms of projection. I think that he's fine, but certainly not a spot where I'd be super interested in taking a stand. Moving on to running back, and I'm going to remember to switch that. And this is probably the only time the entire show I'll actually remember to change the position on the screen. But moving on to running back, you do have Bucky Irving here. This is his third game back from injury. Rachaad White, Sean Tucker still had roles last week. $2,400 price tag on Sean Tucker, $4,200 on White, $10,200 on Bucky Irving. For the ownership, I projected about 40% flex and 10% captain to Bucky Irving, about 25% at flex, 2% at captain to Rachaad White, and 2% at flex, none at captain to Sean Tucker. We've seen kind of two very different things in the two games that Bucky Irving has been back from injury. In the first game back, he just stepped into essentially a full workload. Sean Tucker wasn't involved. Rachaad White was, clearly the RB2, but it was like a 63% rushing market share or something in that ballpark. I'm pulling it up now. Maybe for Rachaad White. Sorry, I can't see my cursor. There we go. The sun is coming in and like blinding my second monitor, and I can't see what I'm trying to do. But in that first game back, Bucky Irving, I overestimated it, but 52% snap share in the first game back, 63% rushing market share. So that's what I had said. And you only have 7% rushing market share for White, 7% for Sean Tucker. Then last week you had 38% for Irving, 28% for White, 18% for Tucker. So you saw more of a split. I think from a projection standpoint, expecting around 50% rushing market share for Bucky Irving makes sense, with Rachaad White as the RB2 slightly ahead of Sean Tucker. But obviously there's a lot of different ways this can go. There is some element of hot hand play calling here where, if Sean Tucker breaks a couple big runs, he's probably going to get a couple extra carries, and that is probably true for all of these guys. So just another spot where there is volatility, but Bucky Irving is, I think, clearly the running back one in terms of he's going to get the bulk of the opportunities. Exactly what that means is pretty volatile. But at 10,200, also involved as a pass catcher as usual. Last week ran routes 50% of the time. His first week back, he ran routes 37% of the time. Prior to his injury, 57, 73, and 57% route participation. So I think expecting in that 50 to 55% route participation range for him makes sense. Clearly, he's the guy that I want to get to the most. He's in 43% of my lineups at flex, 8% at captain. I don't have any Rachaad White at 4,200. I have 7% Sean Tucker at 2,400. I kind of think I'd like to have a little bit more Rachaad White, but I think this is also an ownership thing. The default early in the morning projections that are up on Run the Sims only have Rachaad White at 7%. If that is where I land like later in the day, I would probably want a good amount of Rachaad White just because he is going to be somewhat involved in the passing game. Ran about 35% route participation last week. He's going to get some carries. Obviously, he has some touchdown equity. There's a lot of volatility, but if he's going to be 7% owned at 4,200, that volatility becomes appealing. With the ownership that I used before the show, where I had him at 25%, that volatility isn't that appealing. You know, you have essentially the field already there if he does have a pretty good game, and 25% of the field being there, like I can find some other spots to get to. So I do think ownership plays a really big role always in volatile spots like this, but especially, you know, somebody like Rachaad White here, where he's probably the running back 2 in terms of carries. He's probably the running back 2 in terms of targets. He's going to have a big enough role where he can have a good game, but a small enough role on average where he's probably not going to have a great game. So ownership just really plays a big role in getting to guys like that. On the other side, Bijan Robinson, Tyler Algier, you're expecting a split with Bijan being the RB1 like we've gotten all season long. 44% flex ownership coming in to Robinson, 33% at captain, 16% flex ownership to Algier, none at captain. This is another spot that I think is actually pretty interesting in terms of you could kind of do what you want in terms of inputs. We've seen Bijan Robinson's workload on a week-to-week basis really fluctuate. There had been a trend for a while where it was like an every other week alternating between Bijan Robinson getting a lot of work and then Bijan Robinson being in a lot closer to like a true timeshare with Algier. That trend did break last week. 65% rushing market share for Bijan, 35% for Algier. The week before that was 72 Bijan, 25% Algier. But I do think it's interesting that, you know, you have a Thursday night game this week. So you have the short week. You have a timeshare that's been always a timeshare, but whether it's, you know, 80-20 or 60-40 has really just varied based on game flow, how things are going, you know, who's doing well, etc. So I do think it's reasonable to take a little bit off of Bijan's projection here and give it to Algier, maybe get a little bit closer to that true timeshare. I have, I think, 60% of the rushing market share going to Bijan right now. And then I think like 37% going to Algier. 36% to Algier, 60% to Robinson. So that's still clearly the bulk of the work going to Robinson. He's still going to look very, very good. But it is a little bit of a drop from where I would normally project him just because of it being the short week and the amount of volatility that you do have there. But I'm still getting to him 52% at flex. That's a little bit above the field. 23% at captain. That's a little bit below the field, but still plenty. It's not a good rushing matchup against Tampa Bay, but it is a very good pass catching matchup. If we look at their schedule adjusted fantasy points allowed to running backs overall the last 5 weeks, Tampa Bay has been a slightly below average matchup, but they've allowed the second most schedule adjusted fantasy points to running backs out of the backfield. And that trend holds for the season as well. Third most schedule adjusted fantasy points to running backs in the passing game allowed by Tampa Bay, whereas they've allowed their bottom 10 in schedule adjusted fantasy points allowed to running backs in the running game. So having somebody like Bijan Robinson that is, I have right now projected for the second most receiving yards on the team behind only Kyle Pitts, it is a good spot for him in that regard. He is, I believe, the highest projected player in the game. So obviously he looks very, very good. You are paying a lot for him. He is going to be popular, but Bijan looks good. For Tyler Algier, I think he's another guy where ownership generally plays a really big role. And I only had him projected for 16% ownership. So I'm actually getting a ton of him right now. But again, this all goes hand in hand with not only all the other positions on the slate, but also Rachaad White specifically. We have 4K Tyler Algier. We have 4,200 Rachaad White. In the ownership projections I used, I had 25% ownership going to White, only 16 to Algier. You can see that the baseline default has 25 to Algier, only 7 to White. If at the end of the day, ownership ends up closer to this, then I'm going to be probably taking a pretty nice sized Rachaad White stand and giving up some Tyler Algier. But with the inputs that I used, you have two guys that are the same price. I have a relatively big difference in median projection between Algier and White. I'm going to just slam Tyler Algier into lineups with those assumptions. Now, keep in mind also, you see that like 9.5 fantasy point projection for Algier and like 6.5 for Bucky Irving. When you consider standard deviations and volatility, whenever you're talking about, these like sub 10 fantasy point projections, the standard deviation like is massive compared to the actual median projection. So it's not as big a gap as those two numbers look, but still, if you're going to assume that the field has less ownership going into the guy that projects higher, I'm still going to want to get to him. So definitely a spot to keep in mind, with the inputs that I put in, this is exactly what I would want. Just like slam 4K Tyler Algier and hope for the best. But it is going to be very, very fragile as far as what the final ownership projections are, what my exposures end up looking like to Algier and to White. Einsteinium said, are you reading into Bijan's targets decreasing with Cousins? Yeah, I mean, I think everything just gets worse with Cousins in general, which says a lot because Michael Penix was certainly not great either. But yeah, I did in my projections adjust for the Kirk Cousins games specifically as far as targets per route run and all that type of stuff goes. But it's still like you're talking about Darnell Mooney as your wide receiver 1, Dylan Drummond, David Sills, obviously Pitts will get his targets. So he still projects well. He just doesn't project probably as well as he would in this same matchup with Michael Penix. Moving on to wide receiver, and shockingly going to remember to flip that on the screen again. Moving on to wide receiver again, this is where I think you kind of can you can come up with a lot of different logical assumptions, narratives, whatever you want to call them for the Tampa Bay receiving room. My personal assumption right now, until or unless I see otherwise, is that Evans probably, doesn't run full routes, meaning like 95% of dropbacks, but I'm expecting somewhere in the like 75, 80% range. It was a broken collarbone. It wasn't a lower body injury. I assume that he is in shape, physically. The biggest risk is probably just like re-injury. But also when we can even look, at how Tampa Bay has treated guys this year when they come back from injury. We just had Bucky Irving come back from a weeks long absence and get 63% of the rushing market share. We had Chris Godwin in week 4, his first week back, get a 91% route participation. That's his highest of the entire season. Then he gets hurt the next week, misses another 6 weeks. And then in his second return, they did like the normal or more normal, like ease him back in, 40, 65, 85 thing. But we saw them just throw him to the wolves coming off of a lower body injury last season that, you would expect to limit somebody more than a collarbone probably limits Mike Evans. Also, it's a game that they need to win. Now, you could, if you want to make like an anti-Mike Evans playing a lot of routes argument, you could say, okay, well, what if Mike Evans isn't actually ready to go, but it's a game that they really want to win, and they figure having Mike Evans out there for whatever Mike Evans can do is better than not having him. That's reasonable, but if you go with the assumption that Mike Evans is good to go and he's relatively healthy and, it wasn't a lower body injury. Clearly, this is a game that they would like to win, and having Mike Evans on the field helps with that. So I tend to be relatively bullish on Mike Evans being on the field. Obviously, what level of rust there is a whole different thing that's very difficult to project. But we did see him, getting separation early in the season. He certainly wasn't playing like an old wide receiver or anything like that. And so I am interested in Mike Evans here. I think that he plays a lot. The ownership projections that I used for him had him projected for 26% flex, had Godwin at 22%, had Egbuka at 22%. So I came in right around the field at flex. I had 6% captain on 5 to 6% captain on all three of them as well. I expect that you'll see the field kind of spread things out there. So I was pretty much in line with the field on Evans at 9K. But again, that's at a higher ownership projection than our baseline default stuff has. If he were to come down, if he actually ends up being projected for like 15% or something, I'd probably want more. Same thing with Godwin. I got to 34% there. I think that Godwin, like on the one hand, yeah, obviously Mike Evans is somebody that earns targets at a higher rate than whoever Mike Evans is replacing. But you do get Chris Godwin historically is a much more productive wide receiver when he's running the bulk of his routes in the slot. You get even more of that now with Egbuka and Evans on the outside. The vast majority of Chris Godwin's routes should be in the slot here. And you did also get 85% route participation from him last week. So it's possible that he actually drops some in route participation and they continue to give Sterling Shepard a relatively big workload and, Tez Johnson stays involved. My assumption is more that his route participation stays relatively in line with the 85%, 86% that it was last week. And you just see Sterling Shepard and Tez Johnson go spend a lot of time on the sideline. That is how I would probably approach it if I had Mike Evans, Egbuka, and Chris Godwin on my team. I wouldn't really see a need, I don't think, to use other wide receivers all that much, especially when we just saw Godwin run all those routes. So again, I think that's a spot where like you can adjust up or down depending on what you think they do. Also with Otten being out, not that Tampa Bay runs a ton of 2 tight end stuff anyway with Godwin back, but it makes it even less likely. Like you expect there to be a slot receiver on the field a high percentage of the time when your tight end room doesn't have Cade Otton. So that is a benefit, I think, for Godwin as well. So on the one hand, like, yeah, he maybe sees fewer targets because of Evans, but on the other hand, he's in the slot. He produces better from the slot historically. So it could actually be, I think it's easier to argue that Evans being back could actually be a positive for Godwin than it is for Egbuka. Egbuka, I think, still runs a lot of routes. He is still obviously a high upside guy who, for the second half of the season, has just been completely incapable of catching footballs, whether that's because Baker's making bad throws or not. Just incredibly low catch rate after a good start to the season. But like, I think you can still make the Egbuka ceiling argument, no doubt, but I don't really have any real argument that I could make for like, Mike Evans coming back actually is a benefit for Egbuka, where I can actually make that argument for Godwin. So I am interested in Godwin there. I'm getting to him 34%, which is a little above the field. And then Egbuka, I am actually getting 39% at flex, 10 at captain. I'm a little surprised by that, just because he is more expensive than Evans. He, obviously is more expensive than Godwin. He has the highest projection of the three, but it's not by that wide of a margin. He's, like a point and a half ahead of Evans and Godwin. So that's a spot where, I don't mind having a good amount of Egbuka, but because I know how fragile all of the projections around this wide receiver room are, it's certainly a spot too where I think it would be reasonable to run a sim, see what your lineups look like, and then be like, all right, well, Egbuka's coming in a little bit hot. I would rather end up with like 30% Egbuka and 30% Evans than 35 and 25 or something like that. Completely, reasonable, because there's just so many assumptions that are essentially unknowable going into exactly not only how much are these guys going to play, but how are they going to be utilized? How is the ball going to be distributed? How what changes in production do you get? Obviously you're making educated guesses, but it's certainly a spot where it's a lot more like guesswork than just researching something and finding the answer. Um, Catching up on chat, White might get more work without Cade. I assume you mean the running backs in general could get more passing work, which is entirely possible. Um, Irving did run more routes than White did last week. Not that that is necessarily sticky and has to happen again this week, but I do think that you could certainly see just more checkdowns to the running backs when you don't have Cade. What's the if then on a re-injury? It would essentially be going back to last week. So I mean, I guess then you get the huge question of like, how much is Jalen McMillan capable of playing? Because he's the other wild card that you do have. My assumption is that he's, running like 20-25% of routes as the clear wide receiver 4 behind, Evans, Egbuka, and Godwin. But if you get an Evans re-injury, then you get this like whole other tree of, well, does Jalen McMillan run 70% of routes, or is Jalen McMillan capped at 30-35%, and you go back to 60% Sterling Shepard and 35% Tez Johnson or something like that. So there's basically 2 more paths that you can go down if you wanted to play the Mike Evans re-injury game. You would get for sure a lot of routes from Egbuka, a lot of routes from Godwin. That's already expected anyway, though. So then it would either be like, if McMillan's not really limited, McMillan steps up and looks really good. Or if McMillan is limited, then it's like Shepard steps up, Tez steps up, but it's more muddied where you would want Egbuka, you would want Godwin, and then because it's a single game showdown slate, sure, you would want some Shepard, you would want some Tez if you know that Evans is getting hurt, for example. But I think the scenario where like somebody other than Egbuka, Godwin looks legitimately good if Evans gets hurt would be the Jalen McMillan isn't limited and he just steps into the Mike Evans role if he got re-injured. Marquis said, I expect Mayfield to have all his first team wide receiver squad back. Yeah, I'm really excited, interested to see how this offense looks, given that it's not really clicked for a while now, but they just had so many injuries to so many good players. Again, their offensive line getting an upgrade now as well with Worf's back. AFC Angelo said, honestly, more I think about it, it's probably a net positive for everyone, especially with Otten out. Baker's got all of his weapons finally in against Atlanta too. Yeah. Like I think I view it, I think, pretty similarly to that. Like, I think there's a lot of, a rising tide carries all ships, or whatever the fuck the saying is. The offense overall, like, if this offense just moves the ball better than they have and they score more points than they have, that's good for everybody. In terms of like one guy being projectable to stand out as like the alpha, obviously, like Egbuka projects better when he's playing without Evans / Godwin in terms of just they're going to force feed him the ball, and now they probably won't. But yeah, I think it's I don't really view any of this as like Evans is back, you can't play Egbuka. I think that it probably kind of just comes out in the wash where at 9,200, if Evans were out, Egbuka would be a volatile, high upside, relatively low floor option. And with Evans back, I think it's the same thing. You're probably sacrificing a little bit in terms of target projection, but you're also probably increasing efficiency a bit because clearly the defense has to prioritize different things when Mike Evans is opposite Egbuka compared to even Chris Godwin on the outside. Because Godwin in the slot, Evans on the outside is just a completely different animal for a defense to pay attention to. So I am pretty much on the same page there, where I think the biggest thing is probably just this offense has the potential to suddenly be really, really good. Architels has said, yeah, more passing work for running backs. Yeah, I think that's entirely possible. You think back to like the Lions, not to compare anybody on the Bucs to Jahmyr Gibbs, but even prior to Dan Campbell taking over play calling and Jahmyr Gibbs just going absolutely nuts, you saw like a nice spike in opportunities for him when Sam Laporta was out, for example. It's something that I know Yuta has talked about a lot, and I have too, kind of in a different way. There's a tendency when a player gets hurt to look to his backup to like replace production. But in the passing game, a lot of times you want to be looking to like similar spots on the field. And you see that like on the Atlanta side where Drake London gets hurt. And the assumption early on was sort of like, oh, Darnell Mooney is going to be great because now he doesn't have to contend with Drake London. But really, it's like Kyle Pitts running routes in a lot of the similar areas, whereas Mooney's more of, like your downfield deep ball guy, low catch rate, typically, high A dot type of guy on average. That doesn't necessarily, like, somebody like London's absence doesn't necessarily move the needle that much, and we've seen that. So I do think that, when you get the tight end out and you're not replacing him with anybody that is like a lock to go earn a bunch of targets like Durham, I do think you could see just, more receptions in general for the backfield. Steven said is Worf's playing. He's probable. Choke said had to lock one captain. Is it Bijan? I mean, I guess. It's a weird question in that, like, I would never ever do that. So I don't know. But like, yeah, Bijan's the highest, the highest projected guy. He's like the safest one, but it depends. Like, what's your priority too? Are you trying to solo ship a 500,000 entry tournament? Then no, I'd probably lock like one of the Bucks receivers or something. Or Bucky, like one of those guys that has like massive volatility. But yeah, I mean, the top captain in terms of like just chances of being optimal is, I'm almost positive, going to be Bijan. Yeah, I mean, you can see the optimal captain rates here: 25% for Bijan, 16 for Mayfield, 14 for Pitts, 10 for Irving, 5 to 7 for the Tampa Bay wide receivers. So it really depends like what you're trying to do. But yeah, that would, I guess, be my answer. On the other side, so that's, I guess, moving beyond the main Tampa Bay pieces. I didn't get to any McMillan. He's 3,800. He's not getting any ownership. I have a hard time really wanting too much, but I do think like if he's going to be really low owned, and the assumption that I used was 2%, and I still didn't get him. But this is a spot where, like, projecting the route participation for Tampa Bay was difficult because they have so many guys that like you want to give routes to, but obviously there's only so many routes that they're going to run cumulatively. So if you assume that they're just going to, rely on Godwin, Evans, Egbuka, it doesn't leave much for McMillan. It leaves even less for Shepard and for Tez Johnson. But if you think that they're going to kind of flatten things out and say, all right, well, we were forced into using Godwin a bunch. Let's cut him back to 65% and let's run Evans 65%, somewhere in there in his first game back. That opens the door for, maybe a little bit more McMillan, a little bit more Shepard, whatever. And then, like I was saying before, with the re-injury risk to Mike Evans, also, if McMillan is healthy and just able to play a lot, he would be, I think, the guy that gets the biggest jump in route participation if Evans were to get re-injured. So on the one hand, I think he's clearly overpriced for his median at 3,800, but there is some just kind of like projection volatility there where it's probably not the craziest thing to say, in like the massive field tournaments, to say, all right, well, what if he runs 50% of routes somehow, however that ends up happening, then suddenly he kind of looks decent. But for me, with the assumptions I'm making, I still am not getting there. I don't think I'm getting to the other Tampa Bay wide receivers in general. Don't have Shepard, don't have Tez Johnson. Again, just because my assumption, at least for right now, until I see something different, is that these three are going to be on the field a lot. On the Atlanta side, David Sills, 3K, going to run a lot of routes. Probably not going to do a whole lot of anything, but he will run a lot of routes. Same goes for Dylan Drummond, based on what we've seen in recent weeks. It seems like, but Sills getting a lot of slot routes for Atlanta. He ran 97% of routes last week. He ran 89% in week 13, was 68% the 2 weeks prior to that. Dylan Drummond, 69% last week, 50% the week before that, 39% the week before that. So neither of these guys are exciting. So far, they've been low yards per reception guys as well. Obviously, limited receptions, but 2K for Drummond, 3K for Sills. I have 13% Sills, 7% Drummond. I think that it's an ownership thing again there, where you do want to pay attention to that. 16% projected to Sills, 22 to Drummond. So I am below the field on both guys. And I don't mind that because they're pretty good point per dollar. They're reasonable point per dollar projections. As far as, because they're so cheap. But you do have guys that are obviously not going to dominate targets like ever. They're not the preferred guys around the goal line. You expect, Algier, Bijan, Pitts to be heavily used there. And it's just hard to envision games where low yardage, low target share guys score enough raw points that you have to have them. So when they're popular, I'm fine just not having quite as much as the field, taking some shots on some more volatile spots where maybe they don't project quite as well, but you get a higher ceiling. So I think ownership there matters a lot. Also, I have 11% Mooney at flex, 1% at captain. He just hasn't taken any real step up without Drake London. He's running plenty of routes, 88% last week, 97 and 93 in the 2 weeks prior. Week 8 with no London, he ran 94% of routes. But combination of Mooney just hasn't had a good year, period, regardless of who's at quarterback. And Kirk Cousins just is not doing anything to make anybody better. In the 4 games that he's played without London, 0.13 targets per route run. You have not seen any sort of bump whatsoever in opportunities for Mooney. Now, does that mean necessarily that this week he's just never going to catch passes or not going to make a big play? Of course not. But he is still priced at 6,600, not a wide receiver 1, but a competent wide receiver, and just really hasn't played like one. So there is upside for him just because he is Darnell Mooney. He has obviously had success in the past. Projected for 13% ownership. I ended up pretty much in line with the field there, not taking a stand one way or the other. For the rest of the wide receivers on Atlanta, Tompkins at 1,200, I didn't get to. He's not going to get any ownership. If you want to hope you get the Kyle Williams play where he gets targeted one time and he scores, then sure. But I don't have him. At tight end, Kyle Pitts is the wide receiver 1 for the Falcons. In the 4 games that he's played with Cousins, without London, 0.31 targets per route run. He's running a ton of routes, 86% route participation in the fantasy points data, which is lower than the PFF data, 94%, 83%, 100%, and 100% route participation for Pitts in the PFF data. Either way, no matter how you want to look at it, he's running a lot of routes. He's far and away getting the most targets on this team. He's the wide receiver 1 here, and he's going to be really popular. He's reasonably priced at 6,400. Have him projected for 47% flex and 13% captain ownership. I am getting to 30% flex, 12% captain, so a bit below the field. But still just one of my highest owned players in general, 42% combined ownership. If we sort by flex ownership right now, he's still, relatively high, even though I'm a bit less than the field. He's my 3rd highest owned captain right now. But you do have to contend with a lot of ownership, and it's not like it's a great matchup. Tampa Bay, in terms of schedule adjusted fantasy points, last 5 games, below average matchup for tight ends. Full season, below average matchup for tight ends. So you are playing Pitts because he projects well based on volume. Kirk Cousins has just been peppering him. He's been productive in these games. But at the same time, it's like a fragile projection, not in terms of the workload necessarily, But in terms of the Bucks don't have a lot they need to worry about. You need to make sure, the Bijan doesn't go nuts against you. But in terms of pass catchers other than the running backs, yeah, you're not going to let Mooney run wide open down the sideline, but you're not worried about David Sills. You're not worried about Tompkins. You're not worried about Drummond. You, I think, are at risk of, Pitts is just like that classic projection where you can project all the work to him because it's Kyle Pitts with no teammates. But the Bucks know he has no teammates. And so they, I am sure, in their defensive meetings are coming into this game saying, all right, what are we going to do to take Kyle Pitts away and make Kirk Cousins beat us with Dylan Drummond? Like, that's obviously what the Bucks are going to try and do. So there is some fragility there where you could just get Kyle Pitts, doubled and bracketed and whatever, like the entire game. And Cousins has to then, throw the ball to other guys, which is not likely to be successful and can very easily just lead to a really shitty game from Atlanta. But clearly, in terms of median projection and ceiling, Kyle Pitts still looks very, very good. Behind him, you have Charlie Warner, 1,600, probably running 20-ish % route participation, give or take 15-20%. I'm not getting any of him. Classic tight end, backup tight end play. On the Tampa Bay side, you do have value tight ends here. Payne Durham, $600. Devin Culp, $200. Don't really know what to expect as far as like production goes for these guys. My assumption for route participation is that Durham just steps up into a bigger role. That's essentially what, like, he's been really the only other tight end running routes this season. Last year, you had 3 games without Otten, 88, 64, 54% route participation. This year, Otten hasn't missed a game yet. Durham hasn't run a lot of routes, but he's run more than Culp. My assumption is you're getting something like 65% Durham, probably like 25% Culp, something like that. Maybe it is just Durham steps into Cade Otton entirely, and he's like 85%. But oh yeah, somebody said to change the position. Thanks. I knew eventually I would forget. So I think, again, there's volatility here just in the sense of Cade Otton's running, 88, 90% of, route participation. His high was week 11. He was at 97%. If you project $600 Payne Durham for 85%, then he's obviously going to start looking really good. Projecting him for 65%, I still got to 11% ownership there. I got to 9% on Culp at 25% route participation. That's probably an ownership thing too, where I had 1% ownership coming into Culp, 10% coming into Durham. I don't mind, being around the field on Durham and then being a little bit over on Culp. Just hope that you run good on touchdowns or something. But I also wouldn't argue very vehemently at all if someone said to me, no, it's going to be 80% Durham routes and 10% Culp. Like, yeah, sure, that's entirely possible. So I definitely would pay attention to like what I'm getting from those guys. I certainly wouldn't want any sort of like real huge stand on Culp. I don't think this is a case of like, wow, I see something the field doesn't. And similarly for Durham, like I wouldn't want to just like not get Durham or anything like that. So tight end does give you value here as far as on the Tampa Bay side. Kickers, defenses need to change the position again. I don't know. He doesn't have a kicker. Oh, maybe I think I'm using the wrong overlay, I guess. I couldn't find what I was supposed to use. So there is no kicker thing here, but pretend there's a K next to the DST. We can blame Neil for not giving me thorough instructions on how to use his StreamYard. The normal, I don't really have takes here. I have pretty flat player exposures at kicker, 20% McLaughlin, 11% Zane Gonzalez. Zane Gonzalez is a little bit cheaper. Zane Gonzalez is a little bit lower owned. Chase McLaughlin projects a little bit better. I do have a really big stand right now on Atlanta defense. I have 34% of them, only 1% of Tampa Bay. I think it's a couple of things. One, 10% ownership coming into Atlanta, 25% to Tampa Bay in the projections that I used. So anytime you get that sort of discrepancy, amongst defenses, I am inclined to just go with the opposing defense. But also, it is nice with it in this type of game because, like, myself included, everybody wants to be getting to the Tampa Bay side. I want Evans. I want Godwin. I want Mayfield. I want Bucky. I want Egbuka. I want to punt with Durham. I don't want anything from the Falcons outside of like Kyle Pitts. And everybody is going to agree with that. So if you just take a step back and say, like, at the end of the day, it's a single football game. We've all seen a million primetime games where nothing goes according to plan or neither offense can operate at all. Just from that angle, like getting to low-owned $3,400 Falcons defense, like essentially I'm using them as a pivot to like Dylan Drummond and David Sills. That's fine. It's not that I think they are likely to have success. I think this Tampa Bay offense is going to be much better than it has for a lot of the season very soon, if not this week. They have Wirfs back, which is obviously good for the offensive line. So there's nothing, matchup related that I like. It's more so just ownership and salary related. And Atlanta has been a solid pass defense overall this season. It's not like we're talking about, the Bengals defense or something like that. But even the Bengals, like they come through. We've seen main slates where the Bengals are the defense you need or the Titans are the defense you need. It happens because there's so much volatility in defenses. Tampa Bay obviously would be the defense that I prefer in the sense of if you just ask me what defense do I want to play, which one's more likely to succeed, obviously I think it would be Tampa Bay, but you're getting a $400 price or a $2,000 price difference and 2.5 times the projected ownership right now. Steven said, Atlanta has been rather an easy matchup for receivers and running backs that I'm not sure they will need more than blocking out of Durham. Atlanta's pass defense has been pretty solid this year. But yeah, also, I mean, just having Evans back, you could just see less routes from tight ends in general. Alex said, everyone in the industry has less Bucky at captain than I want. I just want all the Bucky captain with Wirfs and the boys back at home. Yeah, I don't remember how much Bucky I even said I had, but only 8% at captain. But I do like him at captain. Like, I think it's a good spot for him. There's obviously volatility in his workload. That's the biggest thing with Bucky is if you get the workload from 2 games ago where he's 63% rushing market share and White and Tucker are both sub 10, then he looks really, really good. If you get what they did last week where all 3 of those guys were above 10% and, obviously he's less likely to have success, but you did get increased route participation from him last week as well, which is obviously good. So I think, a lot will come down to ownership there too. I had only 10% projected at captain. So yeah, if you wanted to take a bigger Bucky stand, that's definitely one of those spots that I think is volatile. Like you can easily change, I have it right now at 50, 20, 15 here. You could easily go like, 60, 15, 8 or whatever numbers end up working out. And that's going to get you to Bucky. And it's all completely defensible and reasonable from a projection standpoint. It's not just saying like, fuck it, I want more Bucky, I'm going to change numbers. Like, you can absolutely argue that that's how you think the game's going to go. We saw it happen 2 weeks ago. So, yeah, I do think Bucky is absolutely one of the spots where, like, if you want Bucky, you can definitely make reasonable, defensible adjustments to projections and get yourself plenty more Bucky. So that wraps this one up. Hopefully you guys enjoyed it. I will be back here around the same time on Monday while Neil is still in New Orleans. And then we will go back to our regularly scheduled me ignoring him and trying not to fall asleep while he talks. But yeah, he won't. Reminder, no live before lock from Neil today or Monday. But yeah, that wraps this one up. Sign up for Run the Sims. Use promo code Neil. Get 50% off or don't pay me the full amount. Link in the description below, I assume. I don't know. I didn't set it up. So that wraps this one up. I will be doing an NBA show on the Run the Sims channel as well around 4 p.m. Eastern if you want to check that out. Otherwise, see you back here on Monday.